Welcome, this is Newsfirst, and today I'm bringing you a special report about Sri Lanka's inflation rate. I have with me today a very eminent professor from the Johns Hopkins University who has created a public discourse about the inflation rate in Sri Lanka. It's none other than Professor Steve Hanke from the Johns Hopkins University. He is a professor of applied economics at the Johns Hopkins University. Professor Steve Hanke's inflation rate for Sri Lanka is at a staggering 132. But the inflation rate that the Central Bank of Sri Lanka has calculated is at 21.5. What is the difference? Professor, why do you have a higher inflation rate for Sri Lanka when compared to the inflation rate that the Central Bank has given?
This is a very good question because the official inflation rate is 21.5% per year. And the accurate inflation is the one I'm measuring. That's 132%. So the real inflation rate is 6 times higher than the official inflation rate. The official inflation rate incorrect. And the way you calculate inflation in countries where you have elevated rates of inflation is to use what is called purchasing power parity theory. That goes back to the late 19th century. That approach has been around for a long time. I've developed it and used it extensively throughout the world. And what you do is you look at the change in the exchange rate and make some transformation of that into an inflation rate. So that it's the inflation rate for everything in the economy, not just the official things that are being measured, but everything, house prices, goods, services, everything you're exchanging and transacting. So if you ask Sri Lankans whether Professor Hanke's rate is correct or not, they will tell you Professor Hanke's correct. The official's not correct. Because they're going to the store every day. They're buying food every day. They're trying to, if they can find gasoline, they're trying to buy it. If they're trying to buy a house or a car, they know what the inflation rate is. And it's very close to, they will tell you, it is very close to Professor Hanke's 132%. And I've done studies of this throughout the world, by the way, and when the inflation rate is over about 25%, my measurements are very, very accurate, very accurate.
Professor, according to your calculation, Sri Lanka is only a notch away from being the country with the highest inflation rate. We are only second to Zimbabwe. Is it really that bad?
It is bad. It's you know. When you have inflation that high, it's a complete catastrophe. And not only you have an economic catastrophe associated with the high inflation, but you have a real problem because the inflation hits the poor people more than it hits the rich people. So the poorest people are getting crushed by the inflation. So that's a problem. That creates ultimately what? A political problem. So you not only have an economic problem with the inflation and the exchange rate collapsing, but you have enormous political chaos in Sri Lanka. And it looks to me like everything's just going to come to a stop. I mean, you aren't going to have enough money to buy and import anything. Like, what are you going to do with no gasoline, no petrol? You're not even going to be able to drive your car, your motor scooter, or have electricity, anything.
Professor, we know that years of mismanagement and ad hoc decision making in terms of the economy has led Sri Lanka to the current situation that we are in today. What is the immediate step, the measure that we can take to rectify this problem?
You should do what I did when I was a president's advisor in Bulgaria in 1997. Bulgaria was insolvent. The economy had collapsed. They had hyperinflation in Bulgaria. The inflation rate per month, not per year, per month was 242%. 242% per month. And what we did is install a currency board system to replace central banking. And that is a system that actually you had in Ceylon from 1884 to 1950. And that system is one in which the rupee would be issued. It would be fully backed 100% with anchor currency reserves, and it would trade at a fixed exchange rate with the anchor currency. Now that means that the rupee, let's say that the anchor currency was the US dollar. In a currency board in Sri Lanka, with the anchor currency being the US dollar, the rupee would be a clone of the US dollar. It would be exactly the same as the US dollar. And that would stop the inflation immediately and guarantee the stability of the exchange rate, and the economy would get started right away. This is exactly what happened in July 1997 in Bulgaria. I know it because I was the president's advisor. I designed the system, I put it in, and since then, Bulgaria has received nothing but the highest marks and reviews by the International Monetary Fund and everyone else who's ever looked at it. It's got the second lowest debt to GDP ratio of any country in the European Union. Bulgaria does. So it would fix the thing. Everything would be fixed within 30 days. As far as the currency, the inflation, and stability in Sri Lanka. And then you could start fixing other things. But you can't fix anything unless you stabilize the economy. And right now, the economy is in shambles and completely unstable, totally unstable. It's literally in what I call a death spiral. It's getting worse every day.
Professor, you spoke of a currency board. Sri Lanka's economy is very much different to how it was back in 1950. For example, years of balance of payment crisis, and we are not in the same position anymore. So how will a currency board help Sri Lanka's situation?
Well, it fits in very well. It fits into any kind of economy, and it fits into an import economy because you have a stable, good exchange rate, you have low inflation, you will have balanced budgets, and you will have capital coming into the country. In Bulgaria, in 1 year after we installed the currency board, that was an importing country. Communism had just recently collapsed. And what happened? The foreign exchange inflows increased the foreign exchange reserves in Bulgaria by 3 times in 1 year. The capital would flow into Sri Lanka. You not only would be importing goods and services, there'd be an importation of capital. Capital would be attracted to Sri Lanka. And it would be attracted because the interest rates initially in the Sri Lankan rupee under a currency board system would be higher than the interest rates in the anchor, let's say the US dollar. And so it's very profitable to take your US dollars and borrow money in US dollars and send that money to Sri Lanka to get a higher interest rate. So the capital will flow in. That is not a problem. People have to look at the reality of how these things work. And I'm telling you one example that I have personally been involved in, and that is Bulgaria, 1997. I also did Estonia's currency board in 1992 after the Soviet Union collapsed. That worked perfectly. I did Lithuania in 1994. That worked perfectly. I also did Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1997 after the Civil War in Yugoslavia, and that worked perfectly. So these are fail-safe systems. They never have failed. There have been over 70 currency boards. They've never failed. None.
Professor, do you think that Sri Lanka doesn't have enough laws to tackle fiscal indiscipline in the country? Is that the problem we have? Is that why we want a currency board in the picture?
Well, the fiscal laws are something that automatically it's taken care of with a currency board system, because the problem with the fiscal affairs in a place like Sri Lanka, what's happened? The government spends money. The government runs a big deficit. And who finances a deficit? The central bank does. But with a currency board, you can't do that. The currency board cannot extend credit to the government. So unlike a central bank, the Achilles heel of Sri Lanka has been its central bank, because the central bank finances the government. And when they finance the government, that means they print too many rupees. And that's why the rupee collapses, and that's why you have so much inflation. The big problem with Sri Lanka is central banking. You have to put a straitjacket around the central bank, and you have to put a straitjacket around the fiscal authorities so that they have to balance the budget.
Local economists say that the calculation of inflation based on the PPP method is only related to how foreign investors would see the situation in Sri Lanka. However, they say that it is different when a Sri Lankan who uses the Sri Lankan rupee to purchase goods and services. Why do we have to consider the inflation rate that you have for us?
I published many articles in the scientific literature, and this is the proper way to calculate inflation in high inflation countries. That's the end of the story. This is the way you do it, and I've done it, published many scientific articles about it. And if we get into hyperinflation, I am the world's authority on hyperinflations. I'm the only one who's measured all of them, all 62 that have ever existed. So I know how to measure inflation. I know the scientific literature. I've contributed to the scientific literature, and that's really the end of the story. They can debate all they want, but it's a lot of hot air.
Thank you, Professor Steve Hanke, for joining Newsfirst exclusively to speak about the inflation rate that you have calculated for Sri Lanka. It was Professor Steve Hanke from the Johns Hopkins University, a professor in applied economics at the Johns Hopkins University. So we brought you a special report because everyone has been following the tweets and the constant reports of Professor Steve Hanke about the inflation rate in Sri Lanka. So we thought we should bring in some sort of an explanation as to why Professor Steve Hanke sees inflation rate at such a staggering rate. I'm Azra Assan for Newsfirst. Take care.